Another happy landing.
Holy sh**, we made it. We survived the most jam-packed comic book movie month in recent history. And I don't know how these other guys do it around here, because we at Pin Pot Productions are just starting out, and good lord, keeping up with all this is a challenge. But here we are, at the start of something big. Not just for us, but also for the studios that we'll be talking about today. That's right, Marvel and DC have gone and dropped a motherload of releases. I probably could have phrased that better. With Superman and the Fantastic Four First Steps. Two films that, while produced by vastly different creative teams, are tasked with similar responsibilities and setting out with comparable goals in mind. That being to reintroduce a cast of characters that they've been spending decades trying to get right, while attempting to do justice to the endless amount of source materials that these guys have been racking up. All within a month of each other. Crazy how these things work out. So how did these films fare overall? What do they think they did well, and things that they can improve upon? As well as what were the goals they set out to achieve, and did they do just that? And we have time. Answer the question, did these films reignite my interest in their respective franchises? So let's discuss. That's right, 2 movie discussions for the price of 1. Y'all are getting a bargain this week. Or shortchange, depending on how you look at it, considering the fact that I'm not really going to be diving extremely deep into our latest comic book movie offerings. The reason for this is twofold. One, because I feel like unlike with a lot of Marvel and DC films coming out around a similar time, usually it's akin to comparing apples and oranges, but this go around really is the case of comparing apples to apples, because both films are extremely similar in their presentation, the goals they're trying to accomplish, and just the general subject matter. There's also the more production-oriented reason for why I'm combining these two, and that is because there's not a lot of footage to work with right now, considering that both these movies are still in theaters. And not wanting to rely too heavily on the other footage you can collect, I figure I just want to give my brief thoughts on how I feel these films worked out, which may include some spoilers, so just be warned, spoilers are ahead. Also, before we begin, while we are going to be comparing and contrasting the two a little bit, this isn't a case of one versus the other. I will, in the end, give my thoughts as to which one I prefer, but we're not pinning Superman up against the Fantastic Four, because we all know that they would just be friends in the end. So starting with Superman, this movie obviously had a little bit more work to do. Being the start of a brand new cinematic universe, spearheaded by James Gunn and Peter Safran, this is going to introduce us to the live-action portion of what the folks at DC have been working on. And I know some of you are going to be smart with me and say, well, technically Creature Commandos is the first installment in this universe, and you're correct. Here's your Pin Pot Productions no prize. And I guess if you really want to be coy, you could say parts of the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker are even part of this universe, as well as Blue Beetle. Though those projects are tenuous at best, and Creature Commandos is the only thing that's fully connected. So now that we have the groundwork set up, what is this movie about? Well, the title didn't give it away. It's obviously going to be following the Man of Steel, Superman. And we're picking up with him about 3 years into his career. The opening text on screen tells us that this universe is not exactly the same as our own. In fact, it deviates quite a lot in the sense that 300 years ago, the public became aware to metahumans. 30 years ago, Superman showed up. 3 years ago, he revealed himself to the world. I mean, as like a superhero, not like a sex offender or nothing. 3 hours ago, he was fighting some jerk from Baravia, a made-up nation that's definitely not like anything in the real world. Trust me, don't bother looking into it. And 3 minutes ago, he got his dick kicked in by said Baravian jerk. And that's how we meet our Superman. Face down and ass up in the dirt. Or snow in his case. So good job on James Gunn for having his trailers be honest about what his story's about. This then introduces us to the other Kryptonian powerhouse in the movie, that being Krypto the Superdog. Another addition from the comics, Krypto has been slightly tweaked to better fit the story being told, so rather than being the loyal sidekick he is in the comics, Krypto is kind of the worst dog imaginable. An absolute disaster of a companion, messing everything up, not out of malice, but just because the little guy doesn't know any better. I'm sure many of you, a furry friend at home, know what this is like, but you can imagine how much more difficult it would be to deal with if your fluffy little companion could also, shoot lasers out of its eyes. So not the most helpful guy to have around when you're in a bad situation, but he does at least manage to drag Superman's limp body back to the Fortress of Solitude, where he's fixed back up and returns to the fight in Metropolis. We're also introduced to a few other characters like the Engineer, who you might know from the Authority comics, but most importantly, this scene allows us to set up the character in the film that really stole the show, and I knew he would, that being Otis.
Otisburg.
Oh, also his boss, Lex Luthor. And this is going to be our primary villain for the movie, with a couple of secondary henchmen to handle the one-on-one brawls. And really, that's pretty much the long and short of the story of this film. We'll spend the runtime following Superman as he's trying to deal with different threats popping up all over his life, as well as balancing the burden of being a hero that everyone looks up to. Which is extra interesting considering the fact that in this world, unlike every other Superman movie to date, he's not the only Caped Crusader in the spotlight. Yeah, in Dawn of Justice and Justice League, he's paired up alongside the other members of the Super Friends, but never in his first outing. Every Superman movie before this always had him be alone, isolated, the X Factor in an otherwise mundane world, and it's only after his appearance that the weird things begin. And of course, they might retcon that other stuff happened earlier, which makes no sense in the context of the timeline, but with opening with an already existing larger-than-life world, you pretty much sidestep this problem altogether. Anyways, the primary conflict of this film is Lex Luthor doing everything in his power to convince the world that Superman is not the hero that he says he is, but is in fact a fraud. And the real question is, can Superman's love for humanity overpower those who seek to tear down and destroy him? And that's really at the heart of this movie. Superman's love for the people of Earth, and him inspiring others to step up and do the right thing, even when it seems impossible. This can be seen in the fact that he changes the hearts and minds of people like Lois, the other superheroes including Mr. Terrific, Guy Gardner Green Lantern, my goat, Hawkgirl, Metamorpho, and even the people of the city. All individuals who choose at first to not interfere and let events play out as they will, only for Superman to inspire them to step up and take the initiative. A secondary component to this film is Superman's struggle with being an immigrant, seeing him be caught between two worlds. At first not knowing whether he's doing this Caped Crusading because it's what his parents would have wanted from him, only to realize halfway through the film when Lex Luthor unearths that Superman wasn't sent to this planet to protect us, but rather as a conqueror. A storyline that's been used by a few other iterations of the character, particularly Smallville and My Adventures with Superman. And to that end, the only development that Superman really undergoes as a person is the confidence in which he has in himself and the mission he has accepted. Basically reaffirming his initial mindset, though replacing the motivation with doing right by his birth parents with instead living up to the lessons bestowed upon him by his Earth ones. You could argue this kind of muddles the immigration message by saying that it's okay wherever you come from so long as you assimilate to American customs, but I don't think that's what the film is going for. It seems to be communicating more that, regardless of the circumstances of anyone's birth, we all have the opportunity to do great good so long as we believe in the goodness of others. And despite learning some dark truths about his culture, he's still a man caught between two worlds, trying his best to elevate one while not repeating the mistakes of the other, along with just being an inspiration to others because that's just the kind of guy he is. And understanding that he's not the hero that inspires the world because he's the strongest, but rather because of what that symbol on his chest stands for. The proletariat. Oh wait, that's absolute Superman. Hope. As you can see, this movie's really a character study on the icon that is Superman, meaning that a great deal of attention is put into how he reacts to certain situations, as well as what it truly means to overcome them. But this leads us into the problems of the film, most notably in that it's really kind of overstuffed. Like, it's one thing to throw us into the middle of a story, as though we're just tuning into the sequel of an unmade Superman origin film, but the fact that they're dealing with so many side plots and storylines all together at once really does leave little room for the smaller beats. Seems like Superman's interview with Lois Lane, or time spent on the farm of his family, really are the highlights, despite being so separate from the normal hustle and bustle of the rest of the plot. All these things going on in his life really does take away from the more human elements that a lot of other Superman movies really like to delve into. I know that's kind of the point, this go around we're focusing on the larger than life stakes that Superman has to contend with, and the fact that the man just never really gets to catch a break. But the problem with that is that when everything's always at an 11, it kind of numbs your audience, making it hard to appreciate how big the stakes are. But I do think the film manages to rise above this problem in the fact that the character of Superman is so well fleshed out that he helps carry us through these nonsensical conflicts, as well as the more real-world feeling ones. I do think it might have had one too many subplots. The first one I would have cut would have been Superman finding out that his birth parents are not the benevolent saviors he once thought they were. I feel like this could have been much better utilized in a sequel, after having already built up their legend. Back to the strengths, another element I really wanted to give this movie praise for is the casting and the depiction of the characters. Everyone in this film perfectly embodies their comic book counterpart and feels like absolutely inspired pickings. Rachel Brosnahan is the perfect Lois Lane, smart, witty, inquisitive, but also prone to letting the story take precedent over her life, often losing track of the relationships she values in the name of getting the scoop. Superman on the other end is inspiring, kind, caring, but not stupid. As much as he loves people, he does have his limits and is willing to lash out and be emotional. Not to the extent where he hurts someone, but he is willing to put the pressure on those who do seek to do harm to others.
Where's the dog?
He's gentle but not a pushover, caring but not gullible. It's a very difficult tightrope to balance, but I do think David Cornswift is able to walk it. He really embodies everything I can imagine Superman would need to. namely being the kind of guy who can just make you want to be a better person with a smile. Furthermore, his relationship with Rachel Brosnahan's Lois is both believable and endearing to watch. You really do believe that these two people care about each other, in spite of their disagreements. And the other superheroes manage to do a great job as well, most notably Egi Gathegi as Mr. Terrific, who brings such a cold charisma to what could be an otherwise very lame character, and instead just makes him an absolute badass. He really earns that line.
I'm a goddamn Mr. Terrific.
But the real standout of this movie is Lex Luthor being the absolute hater of haters. Nicholas Hoult manages to embody jealous hatred on a whole other level. Someone who has every advantage in the world and still doesn't utilize it to make it a better place, but rather just make it more like him. His shallow arrogance and commitment to the role makes him not only someone you can see being a problem for Superman, but also just a genuine guy you should be afraid of. And the last thing I want to give this movie some credit for is the massive balls that it has. So many films these days are afraid of you feeling strong emotions or just sitting in them, often diffusing them with a joke, and while this film does have a lot of humor, I never felt that it distracted from the actual emotional roller coaster that the cast and crew took you on. There was one instance where the Justice Gang was fighting an interdimensional imp while Lois and Clark were having an emotional heart-to-heart, but upon a rewatch, it's only for a few shots and you really do get to linger on the characters interacting with one another, despite the larger-than-life nonsense going on in the volume behind them. And it further emphasizes that this Superman just can never catch a break, and this is the closest he can get to getting a few moments to himself. And furthermore, you really gotta give this film credit for the fact that it's actually about something. Too many films these days tend to avoid any subject matter that may be construed as them taking a stance on real-world issues. The conflict between Baravia and Jaranpur is noticeably similar to the atrocities being committed in our world right now. And I know it's a heavy topic, one that I'm woefully unequipped to truly do justice to, but I really respect that Gunn didn't shy away from drawing these parallels, as well as had his Superman act accordingly in line with the character as it's written. There's also the wokeness angle of it all, which we're already short on time as is, so I'm just gonna say, he's an immigrant created by two Jewish guys, one of whom is also an immigrant himself, and he's always been fighting bigots, corporatists, and wannabe dictators. This is what Superman's always been about, and if you don't like it, then he's probably not the character for you. But as an overall package itself, regardless of if I agreed with the messages or not, I do think that it was handled in a very compelling way, and one that's quite unique from other offerings of this character. It also sets up this world tremendously, making me endlessly intrigued on where they might go from here. At the end of the day, kindness really is the new punk rock, and I think that this film really does have a lot to offer. But now we move on to the second film I want to discuss today, and that being Fantastic Four: First Steps. A film that finally shows us what the MCU would do were they to have the rights to these characters. So, basically over a decade in the making. 3 if you go all the way back to 1994, which I do. And in this film, the Fantastic Four have already been around for some time, 4 years I believe it is, which of course it is, stopping bad guys and saving the world from threats both of this world and beyond. And we pick up with our crew as we learn that they are soon going to have to change their name from the Fantastic Four to the Fantastic Five, because Sue and Reed
got busy!
And now they're gonna have a baby boy, Franklin Richards. But no time to celebrate, because at the same time, the Silver Surfer comes down from on high and warns them that all they know is at an end because the World Eater Galactus is on his way, and he's gonna... well, the name says it all. A lot simpler of a story than Superman if I do say so myself, but not an inferior one. In fact, I think it's actually quite solid. A direct adaptation of the coming of Galactus with some small tweaks here and there to make it more palatable for a 2-hour runtime. And like Superman, there's a lot to say about this film. Starting with the cast, everyone here is well chosen for their role. Pedro Pascal nails the awkwardness and intelligence of Reed Richards' Mr. Fantastic. Vanessa Kirby captures the motherly warmth and familial strength of Susan Storm, the Invisible Woman. Evan Moss Bachrach brings the grit and charm to what's essentially just a voice role with Ben Grimm, the Thing. And Joseph Quinn captures the arrogant confidence, along with the subtle insecurities of Johnny Storm, the Human Torch. And them, along with everyone else, fits nicely into their role, and manages to deliver when it's their time in the story to shine. And while I do think they assembled a great collection of talent, I can't say at any point I ever felt that the casting was truly inspired. Like, there was never a point while watching I was thinking, these are the only people who could have played these roles, like with some other characters Marvel's casted in the past. But that doesn't mean who they picked didn't still work. Every one of them plays their character well, and they clearly have a lot of chemistry between one another, which is especially impressive considering the fact that one of them is completely CGI. But they all look great in their roles, and I'm interested to see where they take the team moving forward. And this film really does have a lot of good things going for it. Namely the fact that they really just hit the ground running and throw you into this world. A world that I find so fascinating. You see, unlike the normal 616 Marvel Universe or 199999, or however we're designating these things, Earth 828 has much more of a style and flair to its design that makes it instantly distinguishable. Here we are placed in some kind of an alternate 1960s, where since the Fantastic Four charted, they have had the opportunity to reinvent the planet, bringing it into what looks to be some kind of a utopian age. It truly seems like all the crimes in this world have been stopped. In fact, after learning that his wife Susan is pregnant, Reed makes it his mission to baby-proof the world, putting a stop to all super criminals, along with setting up the equipment to monitor this baby, considering the fact that they don't quite know what their mutated DNA will create. Which is a smart decision if you know anything about their child in the comics. But I'm sure you know, this isn't the first time this story's been told. I'm not talking just the comics, but also in 2007's Rise of the Silver Surfer. And in that regard, the movie in many ways is kind of a one-for-one remake. Like, I was honestly shocked while watching how many things these two movies had in common. From the initial spotting of the Silver Surfer, to the growing side plot of something in their life completely changing their team's dynamics. In the first one it was Reed and Sue getting married, and in this one it's them having a baby. All the way down to Susan Storm sacrificing her life in the end, but then being resurrected through cosmic space magic. All I'm saying is that I understand why they changed Norrin Radd to Shala Ball Silver Surfer, because otherwise the comparisons would have been even more noticeable. Like, down to the fact that one of the Storm siblings ends up being the one to persuade Silver Surfer to join their side. But you can make the argument that they're both pulling from the same source material, but the funny thing is they also omitted a lot of the same things like the Watcher, the Ultimate Nullifier, and Alicia Masters' role in the whole thing. But hey, I say, if it ain't broke, don't break it. So that's exactly what they did. It seems that using the 2000 film as a starting base did give them the opportunity to improve on what didn't work and hold on to what did. And going into a little bit more about what worked, this film is one of the first Marvel movies in a while that truly feels like a movie. A lot of Marvel films in the past have had this issue that they've kind of felt more like expensive TV shows rather than genuine blockbuster epics. You know, shooting for coverage so they can edit a scene around rather than constructing it with deliberate intent, keeping everything overly lit so that way nothing is obscured, instead of trying to paint with the light and craft an eye-catching image. And this goes beyond Marvel movies, but of course because they're the biggest studio in the business, they're the ones leading the pack. Thunderbolts is the exception to this, however, it wasn't trying to tell such a grand epic, and therefore the scope was more in line with the story they were telling. And once again with Fantastic Four, they chose to craft this film with a deliberate look. From the set design to the blocking, everything feels like it's done with intent and careful decision making going on behind the scenes. Not shooting the scene in the most efficient way possible, but instead in the most interesting way to watch unfold. And this is best illustrated with how the movie depicts the character of Galactus. No longer a big scary space cloud, which, listen, I get it, they had to do what they had to do in the early 2000s because audiences were, I guess, just not ready for a big purple guy in a suit walking around the city. But it's been nearly 20 years, so let's see that big purple helmeted bastard stomp around Battery Park and smell some dirt. And that really sums up the good in this movie. The characters are well fleshed out, the story is fun to watch unfold, and the world they've designed is just one I enjoy inhabiting. I especially like that every single member of the Fantastic Four clearly has a role to play in the team, whereas in the other films, it seemed like they were all just goofing around until Reed Richards pointed them in the right direction. Reed, of course, remains the team leader as well as the ideas guy, but now Sue gets to play a role as a diplomat and emissary with the UN. Allowing her to broker peace between nations, except for one in particular, gives her a chance to be more than just Reed's arm candy, and instead an individual with her own goals and aspirations. Ben notably does get less to do than the rest of the characters, and I find him to have the smallest role to play, outside of being the pilot and the general smashing guy. I feel like he originally had more going on, but it looks like reports about this film being cut to pieces were not exaggerating. But now I want to get to the character that I really want to spotlight in this go around, and that's Johnny of all people. Because normally Johnny's just a lovable goofball who usually gets left to the wayside. He's the audience surrogate who would be having a blast in this role, but never really contributes much more than burning things up. However, in this film, they go into detail why, of all people in the world, Reed Richards would allow his wife's kid brother on this mission. Because it turns out Johnny isn't the dumbass we always think of him as. The movie instead reinterprets him as someone who lacks direction and motivation. But when there is something he's passionate about, he can dedicate an endless amount of stamina and brain power to it. This can be seen in the fact that he basically takes one sentence the Silver Surfer tells him and figures out her entire language. All because she embodies the two things he loves the most, women and space. Side note, why does the guy whose powers are the least effective in space love space so much? I mean, outside of Earth, his abilities are only good for being the fastest way to get yourself killed. Not really a critique, it's more just something I found funny. Back to the story. Overall, the film does a great job of what it's working with, but unfortunately, this is also where some of the issues begin to pile up. In that what we are seeing is good, but I feel like with just a little bit more time, it could have been great. You know, everyone in the crew bounces off each other in the way that you would hope these guys would, but I do think we're missing a few more character beats. More time for the team to interact with one another, beyond just the mission itself. Because unlike those original Tim Story movies, this movie is the complete opposite in the sense of instead of being character driven, it's much more plot driven. Which is similar to the Fantastic Four film from 2015, but the difference between these two is that this one's actually compelling and well executed, resulting was obviously a better film overall. But the problem is the story that they're trying to tell is one that's both a heavy plot and a deep character study. The Coming of Galactus is an opportunity to explore Reed Richards running into a problem that he cannot solve. And mixing this with the birth of Franklin Richards is to me a bit of an odd choice. Because in that story, it's more about what it means to the future of the Fantastic Four and how their dynamic is never going to be the same. They're all about to be entering a brand new chapter of their lives. But by pairing this alongside the world ending, you really don't get the full scope of either. They don't get the chance to sit in the horror of everything they know coming to an end, while also contemplating how this whole dynamic between these four individuals is going to work with a baby on the way. I understand and appreciate them linking it together by saying that Franklin Richards is Galactus' only hope of finding an end to his eternal torment, but to me this once again feels like something you could have covered in a sequel. It leads again to another case of a rushed film, trying to pack as much as possible into a limited runtime. I wanted more opportunities to get to know this new version of the crew, how they feel about their circumstances, how did their learning to accept themselves change the world. Instead, the story is structured more like something like The Martian, where it's just problem after problem being solved, which works in that film because, you know, these are just scientists at the end of the day, but the Fantastic Four are explorers and a family. A big part of what people love about them is how they interact with one another. And don't get me wrong, there is some of that here, but it just feels undercooked. Like every interaction needed one more scene or another beat to really sell itself. The best way I can describe it is it feels less like that we are part of the Fantastic Four and more like we're following along right behind them. There's just this distance, a barrier between us and them. So scenes where Susan Storm's giving birth in front of a black hole or Johnny about to sacrifice himself to save his nephew are emotionally thrilling in the moment, but with more time to sit with these characters, it really would feel less like we're watching famous figures in a documentary and more like we're watching a person we know and love going through a hard time. So yeah, I wanted to love these guys, but I only ended up liking them a lot, which is still pretty good in its own right. But now we can talk about a bit about how I feel about both these films overall, and how well they succeeded in accomplishing the goals they set out to achieve. And the goals I mentioned are setting up a universe, populated with characters we want to follow for as many stories as they will allow. Obviously, Superman had a bit of a bigger job. Not only was he setting up his corner of the universe, but also the universe itself that everything else is going to take place in. But to that regard, I think they did an amazing job. This world feels so well lived in with endless possibilities around every corner. It feels like nothing is off the table, and every chapter is going to offer something brand new. Meanwhile, in the Fantastic Four's case, it definitely feels much more limited in that it is sectioned off into its own little sandbox in the multiverse, which I mean we'll probably return to sometime in Doomsday or Secret Wars, but for my money, it's not going to be the place that we're going to be building off a bunch of stories moving forward. In fact, I was honestly surprised that they didn't end up destroying it come the third act. Moving on to characters, that's where I also think Superman has a leg up, in that it really did feel more like we were a part of the journey with the characters, rather than watching from the sidelines. The characters in Superman were just more vulnerable and driven by their emotions. Meanwhile, in the Fantastic Four, there was very little conflict between one another, and no one really changed over the course of the story. The characters in Superman all end up in different places from beginning to end, both literally and physically, with Lex Luthor ending up in jail. But even Superman, who doesn't change much, does reaffirm the values his parents instilled within him, and returns to his heroics with a better sense of self. The characters in the Fantastic Four, on the other hand, rarely if ever came into conflict with one another. The only real tension was between Reed and Sue and how they wanted to approach the problem with their son in the middle of it. And there it still felt less like Reed was actually learning and growing as a person, and more like his arc was going from a guy who says the right thing but at the wrong time and in the wrong way, to a person who's a bit more delicate when approaching a sensitive topic, out of a fear that one more screw up and his wife is going to serve him some divorce papers. Silver Surfer is the only one who truly changes, but again, we don't get to learn much about how she ended up where she was. And I mean, it's not really hard to wrap your mind around destroying planets is wrong and you shouldn't do it. So it really feels less like she's been changed and more like she's just less brainwashed. Not exactly holding a mirror up to the audience and revealing an inconvenient truth, now are we? But at the end of the day, I walked out of both these films extremely pleased with what I saw. Finally, a good interpretation of both these characters that's not only true to who they are in the comics, but also doesn't feel embarrassed by the source material itself. I did a discussion on comic book insecurity, and how I feel like it's been plaguing a lot of modern blockbusters, especially those with ties to this type of material. It's really nice to see two movies embrace the stories that inspire them, carrying over everything that worked, regardless of whether or not audiences might look at it and roll their eyes and laugh. They are unashamedly comic book movies, and putting aside your personal feelings on the matter, you can't help but respect the confidence. Add on to the fact that both these movies are shot extraordinarily well, putting you in the middle of the action, with the biggest and best looking effects money can buy, except for the baby, because I guess since Twilight we still haven't figured out that technology.
What's wrong with your face?
But yeah, other than that, it looks tremendous. There isn't this boring gray filter over everything, so we can say it's grounded and realistic. The colors pop, the scenery allows the actors to take up space. They truly brought me into these worlds and had me clamoring to see more. Even the music is a cut above the rest. James Gunn always manages to impress with his needle drops, and in Superman, though there aren't as many as in something like Guardians of the Galaxy or Suicide Squad, when they hit, they really hit. And the score itself is a good reuse of John Williams' original Superman theme, with a bit of a modern twist. And refreshingly, Michael Giacchino was on his A game with this one, and with the Fantastic Four, gave us a score that was both inspiring, forward-thinking, but also a sweet little throwback to the 60s. So many superhero movies these days see music as an afterthought, when in reality it should be the battle cry that signals the hero's triumph. These movies had that figured out, and I give them all the props in the world. I will give the edge out to Superman at the end of the day, just because I thought it was more emotionally impactful, better communicated its messages and themes, and just weaved together so many more stories in one complete package. But that's not to discount the Fantastic Four. They managed to accomplish the impossible, breaking this 30-year-long curse of each movie being incrementally worse than the last. And all at a time when Marvel is really not at its peak. Unfortunately, unlike Superman, it didn't give me much hope for the universe moving forward. I'm still not convinced that they can pull off a hat trick like they did with Infinity War, knowing that they're just not playing with a complete hand. But who knows, maybe they'll surprise me. I'm just excited to see more from both these creative teams in a way that I haven't been in so long. And hopefully it won't be too long until we get to see more of what these amazing worlds have to offer. Well, I did say I wanted things to slow down now, didn't I?